Day 7981. The day the first death happened, I woke up feeling sick. I'd had some kind of nightmare about being drowned, though I couldn't remember the specifics, only that it was oddly vivid. Something else was monopolizing my thoughts. Judas was dead. So, you're sure it's him? I asked. My friend in the defense force, Lawrence, sat down at the other end of the steel folding table. Its freezing, silvery top frostbit my resting arms, even though they're sleeves. Was, Lawrence corrected. Was him. His Adam's apple paced up and down his neck like he was gonna be sick. And yeah, we still haven't been able to identify it, but Judas is the only citizen unaccounted for. I tried so hard not to think about what I could have done, how I left him when something so clearly was wrong. But guilt wasn't the only monster in my head. There was another one gestating in me, impatiently waiting for me to fully realize it. Outrage. At first, it was disheartening to see people like Lawrence, people whose hands we'd all put our lives in, crumble under the weight of simply seeing gore. I even felt sorry for him. After all, I knew Lawrence. He wasn't born tough. He joined the defense force because his family expected him to, not because he was fit for it. But then again, the defense force doesn't do much in the first place. They just patrol and wait for a day that'll probably never come, sitting on their state-of-the-art apocalypse arsenal, and somehow, when something like this happens, they're completely unprepared for it. The more I thought about that, the angrier I was with Lawrence, with the defense force, with this whole mountain. Lawrence's eyes were shut. He was mouthing something over and over. Spoiled meat. It looked like he was saying. I was sure I must have just been mistaken and gave up trying to read his lips. I didn't need to anyway. I knew what he was thinking about. He was thinking about this skinless, hairless, toothless, eyeless husk of a human that he and his men had been called to investigate just this morning. He was thinking about how the blood around the room seemed to lead to or from the air vent, maybe both. He was thinking about how utterly destroyed the finding was, how it could hardly even be recognized as something that used to be a person. He was thinking about how lost the defense force was, how unsure they were of what could have done this, and how unprepared they were for whatever it was. Spoiled meat. He continued to mouth, pressing down on his glistening, clammy temples. His eyes opened long enough to remind him I was still there. Sorry, he mumbled. The fact that Lawrence was so weak isn't what made me mad. Everyone has a right to be weak sometimes, but now was not that time. We relied on the defense force to protect us from anything that might have made it inside, and if all our soldiers were like Lawrence, all trained in shooting guns, but not in shooting people, in avoiding deaths, but not in stomaching them when they occur. If all our protectors were little more than atrophied armchair commandos, who only do what they do because they were told to, not because they're capable, then no wonder this all happened. I suppose it's not all their fault, but retrospect has poisoned my memories. Now that I know what Lawrence had it in him to become, I can't even remember what I was thinking at the time. Everything I thought about him before witnessing these things he and his men have done has been rendered invalid. They were never on our side. When the regular lunch hour came, most of the people who worked in the closed-off areas came to the public cafeteria. Save for the holidays, I've never seen it so full. I've never heard it so silent either. Almost 100 people sat in there without breathing a word, some not even being able to eat. News had gone around fast, and people were already done being afraid. We'd gone more than 2 decades without incident, without death, to suddenly be faced with something so gruesome, so unreal and inexplicable, it had surpassed tragedy. Everybody knew everybody here. Nobody knew how to react. Even the members of the generation before my own, those who had seen the outside world just before we were all pulled inside, were at a loss. Unable to stomach the crowded silence of the cafeteria, I decided to find somewhere else, somewhere I could pretend nothing had changed. Colorado Park. When I got there, I found someone else sitting at the bench outside the window to the failed garden. I squinted, trying to make out who it was, but the room was dim. The turquoise glow of the park's synthetic skies leaked through the thick, overgrown glass and flooded the wall like a fish tank with its wet light. The person on the bench was absorbed with the notebook she was writing in. "Ellie?" I asked. She jumped, looking up with that same deer in the headlights expression. For a stretch of time, the place was completely quiet. She seemed dead afraid of something. She started. "I can leave." I never actually heard her speak very much until now. For the first time, it was obvious to me that she has some kind of speech impediment. "Oh no, you're fine. You were here first. I just didn't know anybody else went here." "Me neither." Things lapsed back into that pale silence again. "Well, I'll go then." "No, you can stay." She looked out at the window and into the faint glow of the park. That forgotten failed attempt at a patch of homeliness that nobody had had the heart to kill completely. We sat there for a while, not saying anything. The bag lunch lay open in my lap, but I was too distracted to eat it. I was looking straight ahead, my vacant stare drawn to the light like a moth, while my eyes waited to be needed again. I don't remember what I was thinking about, just the cool glow of the park and the sound of pencil against paper at the other end of the bench. It came to me that Ellie was my last remaining friend. A friend in the way Judas was, that is. someone that most would consider a stranger. But to me, just a fellow quiet person. That was all we needed to know about each other, to be friends. "Did you know Judas?" she asked. I nodded. "He was my friend too," she said. When I got home that day, I was even sicker than I was that morning. The inside of my throat was dry and rough. My mouth was gummed up with mucus. My eyes watered and stung every time I so much as thought of them. As miserable as all that was, my biggest concern was my gut. It was churning painfully. It felt like I had a belt on being pulled tighter and tighter without letting up or slowing down. I hadn't eaten all day, but I knew I wouldn't be able to stomach anything now, so I decided to go to bed early. I fell into my bed, fully clothed, and tried going to sleep. This time it wasn't difficult at all. My body welcomed an escape from the exhausting pain. My eyelids sealed shut over my red eyes, the brain behind them quickly drifting into a deep, well-deserved sleep. Day 7982. My own room forced me awake like a bucket of ice water. The synthetic sky was at some intense blank setting, drowning the room in blinding whiteness. An unfamiliar alarm drilled its way from the home system speakers into my head. To my unexpecting ears, it sounded eerily sentient, speaking in spliced voice lines I've never heard it say before. I stumbled out of bed, listening to the message repeat itself, until I was coherent enough to understand what it was saying. Public alert. The acting administrator has initiated a level 24 state of alarm. Scream protocol is currently under enforcement. Please step outside immediately and follow any instructions from authorized personnel. Scream protocol? I stumbled to my door and opened it. The synthetic sky outside was set to a pale green utility setting, bathing everyone in an unfamiliar shade. I stared upward, groggy and confused, at the flashing red transcripts of the repeating announcement inscribed in the sky. I felt a hand on my shoulder and broke my stare to see a passing handful of soldiers hurriedly escorting 20 or so civilians through the hallway. Some of the civilians were still in bathrobes or pajamas, or less. Others seemed to have grabbed pieces of clothing when they heard the alarms and were hurriedly putting them on as they walked. Contrary to the lighting, it must have still been the middle of the night. "Sir, you need to come with us," the soldier instructed from behind his protective mask. I stared into the eye holes at his irises with that same deer in the headlights look. I probably knew him, but I couldn't recognize him with that stupid mask. He didn't seem to recognize me either. "What's going on?" "No time. State your name." Morgan Elliott." "Do you live here, Mr. Elliott?" "Yes, I do, yes." "Does anyone else live here with you?" No." "Is anybody staying at your living quarters for any reason?" "No." The soldier turned to one of his companions. "That's everyone in our block," he said. "Let's hustle. They're sealing up in an hour." The hallways we traveled through were hard to identify in the unnatural light. Near the end of the route, I was certain I'd never seen some of them before. We were in the deep levels, skyless, poorly lit concrete tunnels that nobody, save for the people who work there, would ever bother entering even if they were allowed to. The journey ended at the mouth of a gaping blast doorway with a series of electromagnetic locks, just like the ones I used to inspect at my job, but at least 5 times as thick. "Everyone, get inside and line up for the head count," a soldier yelled over the confused chattering. The citizens flocked under the synthetic sky of the cavernous concrete atrium, which seemed to shrink every time another group of civilians was brought in. Inside a spacious cage of chain link fencing atop a waist-high raised platform at the end of the room, the administrator, counsel, and chief of defense stood, and paced behind a metal table with a single microphone surrounded by a mess of folders and documents. When the entire population of the mountain was finally compressed into the room, the massive door closed behind us. The administrator got to his feet. He was a tall man with silvery short-cut hair and a goatee. He wore a light gray suit and tie. Mr. Administrator was a calming figure, only concerned with ensuring the safety and well-being of the mountain. That was probably why they chose him to be administrator at the start. They must have known we'd need someone calming like him, not some inflammatory politician like the ones they say used to run the world before it went belly up. "Citizens of the Colorado Mesa Project," he announced over the aging microphone. Instead of having to fight the chattering crowd, he was met with a cold, sudden silence. Everybody had been waiting to hear him explain this, and he knew that. He must have been a wreck, but he didn't show it. "As acting administrator of this shelter, it is my responsibility to authorize a series of defense measures called the Scream Protocols in the event of a breach in mountain security. Until further notice, all citizens are to remain in this panic room. Supplies will be distributed, and further information will be announced by the council and myself. You are all in good hands, so it is advised we all remain orderly and cooperative, despite..." His speech hit a pothole. He looked down for a second or two, his hands resting on the table as though supporting himself. He swallowed. "Despite the nature of our situation, thank you." And that was it. No frightened chatter, no outcry or loudness coming from the crowd, no unsatisfied individual running up and heckling them with questions. Just silence. The terrified, hopeless silence of 1,000 terrified, hopeless people. Even false hope had abandoned us. Hello, listeners. Thank you for checking out tonight's original creepypasta, Synthetic Skies, Part 2. I would like to thank the author, Pyrous Red, for allowing me to narrate his story. Stay tuned for Part 3. If you enjoyed my narration and would like to send me a story to be featured in a future episode, please send it over to my email. Do not forget to subscribe and click the notification bell to keep up with future content. Thanks again for listening, and as always, I am your host, Marie Lives the Horror.